Guillaume, are you here? Can you hear me properly?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear and we can see you. Now it's exactly the time to start, and I suggest to start, and other visitors of our conference will join us quite soon. So today we are starting a very interesting session, which is dedicated to the experience economy. And right now we will listen to the speech of Guillaume Tibергьena, the Dr. Guillaume Tibергьena, the Associate Professor of Glasgow University. This spring, we were really happy to listen to his lectures. They were really splendid and interesting and curious. And by the way, you can find these lectures on our website, on the part which is dedicated to our master's program, Experience Economy. All of them were absolutely different. Some of them were devoted to ecological tourism. Some of them were devoted to authenticity and so on. So today, I'm happy to introduce Guillaume. And we are happy that you are joining us from Britain, from Glasgow. And the topic of this speech is understanding the role of authenticity in the experience of place at rural and heritage tourism sites, a multiplied case study analysis. Please, Guillaume, let's start.
Okay. Thank you, Ekaterina, and welcome everyone. It's I wish I could be with you, but I guess we will do that another time. So welcome from the southern part of Scotland, and today I'm going to go through the very topic of authenticity, which is a topic that I have investigated across a number of research projects since my doctoral thesis. And really today, I would like to share with you some of the best practice, but also some of the key questions that are related to the question of authenticity in the tourism experience. So authenticity is really a complex term, and it's also a controversial term, especially in tourism studies. But tourism, tourism settings and tourism places are often rife with controversies when it comes to defining what is a heritage tourism product, a heritage tourism experience, or just experiencing places. So tourism settings can be viewed as continuums, with the foremost region, what we call the front stage, being one that is for show, and the backstage, the backmost region, the one that is considered more authentic and motivates tourism consciousness, providing sometimes a chance to glimpse the real. The backstage region here, where the host's genuine cultural heritage is maintained and cultural integrity and identity is kept, is often the intimate and authentic part of the tourism destination that is sought by some visitors. Not all visitors, but this is a growing segment of the visitors that are looking for the authentic. So the concept of authenticity is inevitably linked to the kind of tourist who are visiting the site, and especially the tourist perception of authenticity, while highly personal, can still be influenced, segmented, and analyzed. And for some tourists, authenticity can play really a central role, while for others, it's secondary. So these tourists want sometimes authenticity, but not necessarily a reality. The experience of place, despite being largely socially constructed, can thus depend on several factors. And I'm going to detail some of them today that I will exemplify later on across a number of different case studies that I investigated in my own research. So the first one is the concept of intimacy. And the real challenge in tourism is the relationship between the tourist and the host that often lacks intimacy, that is required to fully appreciate the complexity of cultural heritage. And academics like Conran highlights the importance of intimacy as a way to share tourism experiences, because intimacy is embodied experience that arouses a sense of closeness and a story about a shared experience. And in the field of tourism, authenticity can also be perceived when reciprocal exchange between host and guest happen, and the cooperation really between host and guest. So reciprocal relationships between host communities and tourists can develop out of productive exchanges and participatory activities that can enhance the local community's understanding of tourist expectations. And the potential of the host-guest relationship doesn't allow only the opportunity for mutual knowledge between both parties, but can also enhance the understanding and acceptance of both parties through interaction. And again, I will show and exemplify this a bit later on. Existential authenticity is really a key turning point in tourism studies when we're looking at what authenticity does for tourists in tourism settings. And a more existential approach to authenticity is argued by some scholars that takes into account expectations of visitors in terms of really a lived experience. So the personal investment and emotions of the tourist in the quest of authenticity are becoming more important than the object-based type of authenticity. So the existential part of the tourism experience becomes the central interest rather than the objects that tourists can see. Performance is again another turning point in tourism studies when we look at the question of authenticity within the tourism settings, because it is argued that tourists not only gaze, but they also perform at sites, at specific sites in particular. So by including actions and emotions in performance-based touristic spaces, visitors can authenticate places through their emotional connection. So the real difference is the connection between tourists and the cultural landscapes and the tourists and the places where they are embedded. So it is proposed that tourists can achieve an authentic experience through really the relationship with people and tourism setting. And more recently, some colleagues and myself defined or explored the question of disorientation and the question of authenticity and how they're linked to one another in the experience of place. And in some contexts, disorienting experiences contribute to shape the visitor's perception of authenticity of the places they visit. And it can be done across a number of different landscapes that I will detail a bit later on. And disorientation, if carefully managed, can generate positive emotions for the visitors involved and contribute to the uniqueness of the tourism experience. Now, in the academic environments and also across a number of different contexts, authenticity is coming back because we're seeing a growing number of tourism places, a growing number of tourists around the world. That was before the pandemic. But as tourism resumes again, it's happening again now. And really, the narratives around the question of authenticity is about questioning really what is authentic. And it is argued, and again, some of the most recent research projects argue that to live like a local, the slow tourism, the immersion are the new mottos and markers for meaningful tourism experiences. And the real question nowadays, I would argue, is what is a meaningful tourism experience? And I think the question of authenticity has a big role to play into the mix. So when we're reinventing the local in tourism, the insider perspective, the informal, authentic tourism encounters, when tourists are involved in the tourism experience as co-producers, when the local knowledge is shared and provided by the host, when intangible resources, as much as the tangible resources, such as objects, are important. But more importantly, I would argue, is how local communities can be empowered in the placemaking process. Most of the time, tourism is defined by government officials or by the people who are in power. And of course, it depends on different contexts, whether you have a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach to tourism development. So when we're looking at heritage tourists, the question of authenticity becomes important because it's important to try to define what the tourists want, what they are looking for. And when we're looking at heritage tourists, and when we're looking at developing tourism across rural contexts, these tourists travel usually more than often than the average, and they spend more on travel than the average. Travel is an essential lifestyle component, and they are usually willing to pay for services that will help them achieve their goals. And they tend to make travel purchases now on the internet, so they're quite internet savvy and heavy tech users. They're very much independent travelers and don't see themselves as tourists. They like to research individual experience. And they seek encounters with the authentic, while appreciating nature, history, and culture of their destination. They value independence and choice and determine their own pace of travel. And they are quite inexpensive to attract and acquire because they usually tend not to respond to advertising. Of course, this is a segmentation, one kind of a segmentation, if you wish, and it's not valid for all types of tourists. But if we're looking at heritage tourists in rural areas, and if we're looking at different models of tourism development, this is some of the common values and perceptions and attributes that we find about those tourists. Now, the real question behind these strategies is why authenticity is important. And to understand this, you need to look at what we call tourism yield. It is really how you can capitalize on the question on an authentic tourism experience from the visitor perspective, and how the local community can interact and support this so that you can increase yield, you can increase return visitation, and you can maximize really what the visitors are experiencing about the place. So I'm going to browse a couple of examples around the world from my own research projects and share some of the findings that we found with some of my colleagues here. And I'm going to start with ecotourism development in Kazakhstan. So lots of my research was made in Kazakhstan. And the reason why I'm presenting this today is because I think there are a couple of crossovers with Russia. So, except that for ecotourism in Kazakhstan, the ecotourism industry is centered around the former nomadic culture. And when we talked about existential authenticity, just to give you an example, the experience of drinking tea in a yurt camp in a valley of Kazakhstan enable tourists to rediscover their essential selves and have a sense of existential authenticity by sharing this experience with the semi-nomadic lifestyle breeding community. So tourists were hosted in those yurts, and they were coming really from all over the world. And just the fact of being there, even if the yurts were not necessarily the yurts that were used by the nomadic people back in the previous century, their experience was existentially authentic. And when a couple of quotes here to exemplify this further. So some of tourists said what was authentic were the little moments during the visits, such as living together with other families in a small village as a community where everyone knows each other, where in the summer people dine outside and drink kumiz, that is a specific horse fermented milk that is still drunk in Kazakhstan from their own cows and camels, when people sleep outdoors during spring and summer and sing songs with a dombra, which is a traditional two-string guitar to entertain the family and guests. But also what they valued was more spontaneous relationships, such as a rare, a unique experience favoring spontaneity, living in the present tense, and sharing really their experience with the local population. What they also favored is what I called in the project creative reciprocity. It's not only the tourists being interested in their guest, but also the guests being interested to discover more about the tourist. And so organizers are not aware that we're really interested to discover more about the homestay providers. But some tourists expressed the willingness really to know what the guests, what the local populations were feeling, their points of views, and how they could interact with them, how they could exchange further with them. So this is what we're talking about. We're not in a yurt setting, as I showed previously. We are literally, so semi-nomadic populations live almost half of the year in villages in Kazakhstan. And this picture to me is really interesting because you can see a couple of tourists here. You can see the tourist guide. These are people from the government and local NGOs. These are the people who are hosting the tourists, and they're eating the traditional meal in Kazakhstan, which is called besparmak, which means 5 fingers, and we're talking here about horse meat and the traditional nomadic meals that are still eaten nowadays. But these tourists are really immersed with the local populations. They're sharing the meal with their local host, and they manage to exchange further because the local guys can translate for them, and they have a very intimate, reciprocal, and existential type of tourism experience that is really linked to what they were looking for in the first place. Now, what we also discovered is that throughout the question of authenticity, the craft making industry has a very important role to play. On the left side here is Bahit, is someone that I interviewed for my research, who made the kilim, the carpet behind, and some tourists were interested to buy those carpets because they were made by the very people who hosted them. And on the right side, we've got small souvenirs that are small yurts made out of fur that were given at the end of a tour to tourists. And when we're looking at craft making really act as repositories of an authentic tourism experience. It's something that you will show back home, saying, I've been there. And so again, under the question and the prism of authenticity, what is really authentic, and what has authenticity, what kind of role authenticity plays into this tourism experience? And the last point that we discovered in this specific context was the question of eco-certification. And again, authenticity has a role to play here, because by eco-certifying those local guest house, and we're talking here again about Bahit, about the person I showed in the previous slide, they achieved the first tulip eco-certification, with the number of tulips being given to different levels of comfort, but also different levels of genuineness of what was offered for food, for example, or the types of crafts they were producing in the village. So all of these different certification procedures are certifying authenticity. And again, it acts as a label, as a proof of authenticity, if you wish, for visitors who then select those tours in particular. We're moving now from Kazakhstan to New Zealand. It's also a place where I lived and researched and did my research. And we found the same types of questions across different heritage tourism places and across what is called a living Maori village, Whakarewa. And we looked at, again, the question of what was authentic from visitors' perspective and the tourism suppliers' perspective across different dimensions: souvenir shops, cultural performances, on-site craft making, food making, which is called hangi, and more traditional meeting houses from the Maori culture. So these are, again, acting as repositories of an authentic tourism experiences. These are souvenir shops. This is a local craft making made in the village itself, so you can come and witness that. And these are cultural performances practiced. Now, I was part of the visitors who witnessed that cultural performance. And again, what does it add to the tourism experience? Is that authentic? When the Maori people dress in traditional clothes from, again, the previous century and perform their traditional songs, what does it really add? Is that authentic? how is it perceived? Or when the tourists are hosted in traditional marae and visit the Catholic Church of Immaculate Conception, because both of these traditional traditional places and meeting houses are present on site. So tourists experience different phases of the past throughout this living village. But what was really interesting, and going back to the question of existential authenticity and performative authenticity, is the fact that tourists, that you can see here, were offered the possibility to cook the meals with the local Maori populations the same way as they are doing it for themselves. So again, back to defining authenticity, we're having a form of performance here where tourists are asked to perform the cooking by themselves, and they really, really enjoy that. And that experience really, when they came back home, when we interviewed them back home, they were saying the most authentic part of my tourism experience, we're not witnessing the cultural traditional dance. It was really doing it ourselves and doing it with them. So I'm going back now to Kazakhstan and to the Gulag Heritage. So again, this is my latest research project that was undertaken the last 2 years in Kazakhstan. And Gulag tourism was defined by a professor in the US called Hardy in 2012. But what we really looked at is different Gulag museums in the Kazakhstani context, mostly in central Kazakhstan here, across the capital city of Nur Sultan, and then in the center of the country in Karaganda. And when we looked at these two museums, Gulag museums in Kazakhstan, again, there's a lot of different forms of authenticity that can be defined there. We've got architectural and spatial authenticity, which is really looking at architectural buildings and how they are presented and how they are used in the tourism experience. We looked at what was called tactical and visual authenticity, which is really about presenting artifacts, presenting objects from the prisoners that were actually imprisoned on the sites. Another type of authenticity that is defined is called narrative authenticity. And this is when the story is being unfolded and narrated through dioramas, or when they are created through different performances. And then we looked at, again, existential and performative authenticity, when tourists had a very strong sense of authenticity because they could either witness or have a specific relationship with those sites. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples. So the Gulag museums in Kazakhstan, we found different types of authenticity. We found architectural fantasy, we found information, photography, memorabilia, and we found a lot of experiential tourism developments, as I said, through dioramas, what we call atmospherics, guided tours. But we also found reconstituted Gulag performances. And to start with, this is the Museum of Algiers that was created in 2007 by the former president of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev. And as you can see, these are not buildings that are reused, like the ones you have in Perm, where you are based. But these are museums that have been completely created from scratch with modern architecture. And the fact that they are modern is really disorientating, because you come to the site expecting to see former architecture, maybe barracks from the Gulag back in when it happened, and you find what we called an architectural fantasy. And when we interviewed the museum curators and the director of the museum, they were saying they had all sorts of explanations, but mostly symbolic. The fact that this building had no windows because they wanted people to really focus on the objects. So that was a bit of an unusual approach to developing a museum around this part of their history. What was less unusual is to find, this is Gulag, and this is the administrative building of Gulag back in the days. And now the museum is actually hosting all of the collections of the Gulag camp in Kazakhstan. Gulag was one of the most important gulags back in the days. And this is used now as, again, a mean to convey authenticity for this. So when visitors are coming there, they can feel they can feel authenticity because they are actually in the original premises of the Gulag administration. And so switching from architecture to visual and tactical authenticity, lots of photographs, which is not unusual to see in a museum really, really acted as an opportunity to witness and study physical objects and were perceived as objectively authentic by both the suppliers and the visitors. But all forms of memorabilia, from objects that belonged to the prisoners to pictures and documents, were perceived as genuinely authentic, even if, and the visitors don't know this, these are replicas, these are copies of the original documents, except of course the objects that are original. But when they try to switch from all this visual and tactical authenticity, they actually embedded a lot of the classic and a bit old-fashioned ways of portraying or conveying a story, which is the use of dioramas. So in Algiers Museum, they reconstituted scenes of interrogations and arrest, but also this is another diorama created in a barrack outside of the Algiers Museum, where they actually portray a guard taking a child. When the children were 2 years old, they were taken to an orphanage and separated from their mothers. So they try to use different techniques to convey authenticity. Some of the more unusual ones were at the basement of Gulag Museum. And the picture on the right that you can see, they actually recreated almost an atmosphere to darken the tourism experience. So they for example, there was a scary music in this corridor, and it's really a first of its kind. And they recreated heartbeats to recreate what the prisoners were feeling when they were taken to this basement, and some of them were shot. But it never really happened at the basement of Gulag Museum, which is the interesting part. So this is completely staged. Again, this is used to convey more emotions, to create more emotions, if you wish, in the visitors. What was even more surprising was reconstituted Gulag performances, what was called narrative authenticity by Welby and Pichet. And when we interviewed the museum curators, they said, well, we recreated the scenes of the life of the camp. The employees wore clothes from the Soviet times. They acted as the women who were arrested and brought to the village. The guards accompanied them to the camp. And then we performed the scenes when children are removed from their mothers, the thing I showed a bit earlier. And I think that we managed to perform these roles because we work in this environment. And again, so there is a small video here about what is meant by doing this that we may play later on if we have time. It's really about recreating with the clothes from the museum and what really happened back in the days. But again, if you look at this from the tourism experience perspective, what is that really authentic? And what is really the main goal of doing this? Is it to create emotions? Is it for children to understand what happened back in the days. So all of these techniques were used. The very last technique, which is an extremely controversial one, and is developed across a number of Western museums in particular, but they started doing this in Kazakhstan as well, is to actually not only perform what happened, but reenact scenes of torture. And again, taking actors to perform what was done. And again, so they call it the night in Gulag, and they open the museum during a night, one night, call it the night at the museum. And they actually, where you can actually stay there and almost witness all parts of what the prisoners were experiencing. So if you wish, we have a gradation, we have a spectrum of different techniques to convey authenticity, from using buildings and architecture to objects and to dioramas and stories, and then to moving to a more experiential type of museum development. So this was just a three different research contexts and different heritage tourism settings that I wanted to present. Now I would like to move for the second part of this presentation to events, because events, and this is a very big part of the masters that you're offering, and the experience economy is really rooted now, and especially in tourism studies, with events. So events play a very interesting and important part of the tourism experience nowadays. And now, again, if we're looking at authenticity under the prism of events, the real questions is, if we're looking at heritage events in particular, is twofold. How are social representations of cultural events formed? And under what circumstances are events commodified and authenticity lost versus traditions renewed and culture revitalized? And when you're looking at really destination management, the authenticity of the tourism experience, as we discussed before, is really an interaction between the host, the guest, and the place, and how it is negotiated between these three components. And Getz, already back in '98, really looked at that from what he called a convergence or a divergence perspective. And if we're looking at the level of cultural meaning here, and the level of community control and acceptance and the tourist perspective, when there is a convergence between what is tried to be conveyed throughout events and how the local community is involved and how it is perceived by tourists, that's usually when you have, if you wish, a very high level of authenticity. But it remains a dilemma, because most of the time you have a divergence. And we're going to see one specific example of a reenacted event in Kyrgyzstan. So again, I was very lucky to witness a horse festival event around the horse culture and the nomadic culture in Kyrgyzstan. And Kyrgyzstan is a country that is neighboring Kazakhstan. They used to belong to USSR during Soviet times. And when we're looking at reenactment events, the very interesting part of that is that it's used as a celebration, enhancement of community pride, and also a way to maintain cultural identity. And they're performed by societies and groups often to celebrate and reaffirm some aspects of the culture, whether it's local culture, regional culture, or national culture. And it is used to really foster the sense of place, to showcase the sense of place, if you wish, to the visitors. And the case study here that I'm taking is called Echebish Festival. And it's a festival that is particularly focusing on the relaunch of the Kyrgyz horse culture in high mountain regions of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And it's used to support the organization of the Kyrgyz traditional equestrian games and races. And it's used for the development of a national and international institutions framework for the protection of the biodiversity and the diversity of the cultures. But more importantly, it is used to rehabilitate the Kyrgyz horse and the revival of the traditional craft industry. such as saddlery, weaving, felt, embroideries, by supporting artists and craftsmen. So relaunching the leather goods in particular, but also used in ecotourism development to provide technical and promotional support to the associations of guides and for the tourist companies which organize equestrian and pedestrian trekking. So this is what we're talking about here. They are literally reenacting games, traditional horse games from the nomadic times. And you can, and these are pictures from David Trenning, which is a journalist who lives in Almaty in Kazakhstan, but they are literally reenacting those games for tourists to showcase the traditional Kyrgyz nomadic culture. So this is a shankhobez, this is a traditional instrument. These are dombras, the two-string guitar that I talked about earlier on. And this is a traditional horse game where between a bride and here her husband, who has to catch the bride before a certain end, if you wish. So it's like a small race. But also you can witness eagle hunting and traditional yurts, food and shelters, and also horse races. You can also witness what is called kokbar, which is or kokburu in Kyrgyzstan, which is a traditional horse game where a carcass of a sheep has to be taken to different fields, if you wish, almost like a football game on a horse, but this is a traditional game. So they're reenacting all of these different elements of the former nomadic culture for tourism and commodifying those cultural heritage practices is really advocated by, for example, Ishen Obolbekov, which was a horse trekking guide, by saying, of course, our horse games have been commercialized, but this is our history and our past. And tourists also want to know who the Kyrgyz people are and what the nomadic life is or was. The horse games are the testimony of this time. So literally taking this time, here. So this is what was mentioned. But then, because this traditional horse was actually very successful, it was then commodified further by the Kyrgyz government, and to the extent that they're now organizing the World Nomad Games, and it was held in Kyrgyzstan in 2016, inviting very famous actors here like Steven Seagal, or actually organizing a mega event around the nomadic culture. And again, looking back at the question of authenticity here is, what can really be authentic when you're moving from a very small scale event with traditional games and traditional nomadic culture being portrayed to something that is really so big that you can't have any sense of relationship, reciprocity, exchange, intimacy, and performativity, because all the performances are performed by actors and by professionals, but really the visitors are left to see this, not to be part of this. So really the questions are reenacted historical events is how we can explore the relationship between authenticity and identities, and what are really the roles of the professional heritage industry, the public policy applications. What are the roles of the tourists witnessing those events, of the event organizers, and us academics in the field in making such events meaningful, going back to the question of what is a meaningful tourism experience and how we can produce them in postmodern cultural heritage attractions. I'm going to finish this presentation with the region where I am based, where our masters in tourism are based in the south of Scotland, called Dumfries and Galloway. And This is a very rural area, but when we're looking at the event industry and the national tourism strategy and event strategy, they are clearly defining events and business events as two of the four key assets to provide authentic experiences for Scotland visitors, and which really underpin the industry's growth ambitions. And this strategy is called Scotland, the Perfect Stage. And again, if we're looking at making of what is behind this strategy, is again the same considerations: the people, the strong sense of identity, the cultural identity and heritage, the rich history and ancestry, the reputation as a leading nation in the fields of education, architecture and innovation, museums, galleries, iconic poets such as Robert Burns, and of course musicians and the vibrant contemporary cultural scene. But also, of course, Scotland is perceived as a fantastic, of having a fantastic natural environment and dramatic landscapes, and built facilities, castles, long history and traditions in architecture, including castles, cityscapes, and contemporary design. And of course, signature events such as the Edinburgh Festival, the Celtic Connection, and a strong portfolio of golf events and annual events throughout the year. So going to the national strategy, the regional strategic framework in the region where we are embedded, which is one of the most rural regions in Scotland, is again advocating authenticity. And that's literally taken from the strategic framework, and providing authentic experiences throughout nature, heritage and culture, destinations, events, and business tourism ventures. And when they looked at authenticity, or improving what they call improving the customer journey, it was really throughout, food and drink, throughout transportation, accommodation, and the digital connectivity that we talked about a bit earlier on. That was really what some tourists, when they're looking for information, when they are experiencing a place, they're looking at with their mobile phones. So the event tourism in my region was really estimated as an annual value of £269 million, representing a significant opportunity to keep developing and improving the region's tourism project and to support the rural economic diversification. So from the Scotland, the Perfect Stage national strategy to the event strategy that was developed here, really what was looked after is a collaboration and a cooperation, but looking at developing community-led events. So again, going back to what kind of events can be developed, these are what were called the 7 signature events of the strategy. And so these are a mix of heritage events, a mix of sports events, but more importantly, whether you take the Wigtown, like a book festival in the region, or the Big Burn Supper, which is really a music festival, among others, and arts festivals, all, if not, except maybe the Tour of Britain and the Scottish Rally, were tried to be rooted in the local communities with the help of the local communities. So developing signature events in the region, it was perceived as a priority because they were bringing community benefits, but they were also indigenous to the region and closely associated with Dumfries and Galloway, and as a result contributed to the identity of the region. So looking back now in the future about Scotland Outlook for 2030 tourism strategy, literally they are now coming post-COVID with trying to immerse tourists in the nature of Scotland. And because the COVID industry, the COVID-19 is impacting the tourism industry very badly, it's developing tourism in rural areas is seen now as a priority. And again, the back to the national strategy of Scotland is to embed those local communities, to embrace the stories and the world famous assets to the visitors and to emphasize strong partnerships. Because they believe, back to the question of yield and why tourists and how tourists can maximize their tourism experience, they believe that doing this, visitors will stay longer throughout the year and see more of Scotland and spend more during their visit. And so the strategy, and really it's taken from the main document here, is focused on these 4 priorities: our passionate people, thriving places, diverse businesses, and memorable experiences. And if you look a bit closer, the strategy, you see again authenticity coming back into the mix. So visitors to cities are looking for genuine experiences, and the future of tourism is rooted in authenticity. They want to live like locals. And Glasgow's appeal as a heartbeat of contemporary Scotland, it will contribute to our ambition to be a world leader. So beyond the rural areas that I just talked about, the urban settings, the urban destinations in Scotland are also perceived as a way to convey authenticity. So what can we conclude throughout these range of case studies and analyzing authenticity really throughout those case studies? First of all, the things to take on board is the local community empowerment for tourism development. In all of these case studies that we talked about, including the case studies about the Gulag museums, the local communities have a very big role to play. The big role is about really being part of the tourism experience, but also being consulted in how tourism is being shaped in those areas. The second big conclusion is to redefine the boundaries of the tourism products and experiences. To really shy away from those mass tourism tools that are being developed to a more intimate, reciprocal, and existential tourism experience that makes sense for tourists, that are meaningful to the tourist. And authenticity is really now perceived across a number of tourism destinations around the world as a unique and important feature in tourism products and experiences, because they lead to a very strong yield and return visitation. When tourists are satisfied by the tourism experience, when they were looking for an authentic tourism experience, they usually, if they manage to find this, if the tourism suppliers manage to deliver on this, they are highly recommending those tourism destinations to the return visitation, participate to the financial sustainability of those places. And the last element is really about the event tourism experience, is to have a community ownership that is really rooted at the center of the national strategy and the event portfolio strategies, and that those events, especially community-led events, are integrated in public policy for the host destination. So building authentic and community-led events rooted on the host community, where the community has a very strong role to play with all the different stakeholders involved, is a strategy that is heavily now used in Scotland, and particularly in rural areas of Scotland. So I just would like to end this presentation with 3 pictures. The 3 pictures about the Scottish landscapes. And this is a hashtag of the Scot spirit, and this is called a bothy. A bothy is like, if you wish, the yurt of Kazakhstan or the yurt of Kyrgyzstan, is the way now you can experience remote places in Scotland. And this is the type of tourism that is developed nowadays, that is emphasized in the national tourism strategy because of the COVID tourism industry. And this is the type, this is a very famous castle from historic Scotland that you can visit. And this type of tourism, where you embed tourists in those natural landscapes and cultural landscapes, is, I believe, the future of the tourism industry post-COVID in particular. And it's a growing type of tourism for staycation as well at the moment. And you see, the question of authenticity that was defined in the Visit Scotland Tourism Strategy 2016 and 2020 was already emphasizing this amazingly 5 years ago. That Scotland is an individual place, not one of mass tourism, but a special mystical place that offers a real and authentic experience. And that was 5 years ago. Is that still the case? Pretty much so. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very curious, especially taking into account of the experience economy. And please, can you return back the last slide with the slogan? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I'm going to.
If it's possible, because it's very curious. Thank you for your wonderful speech. Yeah. That yes, we waterfalls. Yes, exactly.
So basically, having a hashtag.
Before that, yes.
Before that.
Yes, before that. No, with the slogan. It was very curious because these are two things that we are talking very actively right now about personalization and about the individual. This one, yes, thank you. Yes, exactly. Can we say that the slogan can be used for the whole tourism in nowadays, especially in pandemic period? Because now we speak a lot about individualization of tourism, about the tendency towards personalization. We don't speak about mass tourism anymore because of a lot of restrictions connected with COVID and pandemic period. So can we use the slogan in speaking in whole about tourism in modern days?
I mean, you know, when we're looking realistically at the tourism industry nowadays, the last 2 summers in Scotland, 99% of tourists were from the UK. I mean, you know, I exaggerate a little bit, but really a very high preponderance of local and UK tourists. But now that tourism is resuming a little bit from European countries visiting here, different regions, there are 2 things happening here. The first is a trend, as you said, about the willingness to experience individual travels, the willingness to have a unique experience, the willingness not to be part of mass tourism with a very high number of tourists. And you know, even across the different research that I undertook, some tourists were telling me, you know, Guillaume, the only reason why I'm coming here is because I can be the only one in the area. But if you had COVID and the health risk of COVID now, this is even more prevalent. This is even more important than before. Like the type of tourism when you have very small numbers of tourists in places where you have little risk to catch the virus, where you have the possibility to have a real exchange and a real understanding of the place, because precisely you can have the time to experience the place. And yes, absolutely. I think that this word of authenticity, but it is used now by a number of national tourism boards and DMOs by a number of countries around the world. The special thing about Scotland is they're using the mystical aspect, you know, the fairies. Like a lot of the history and a lot of the heritage of Scotland is rooted in all these stories about fairies, really. So that's why they have used it for their national tourism strategy. But I would argue again that is, you know, this term authenticity is really key, because behind authenticity you can put the cultural landscapes, you can put the traditional heritage practices, you can put a lot of different traditional culinary traditions, architecture. There's so much that could be that this term encompasses.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do you have any questions, please? Maybe you would like to ask something. Stanislav, yes?
Guillaume, thank you for your presentation. I have a question about authenticity and the parts with revisiting. You said that authenticity helps to increase revisiting for the territory. Do you mean that authenticity independs some emotional, creates emotions that increase the willing of tourists to revisit this territory because of the authenticity? Is it right?
Absolutely, and this is the term called yield and return visitation. We found across those different projects that authenticity was a key aspect of the tourism experience the tourists were looking for. And when it was delivered, so you know, in the examples that I showed, when tourists were going in steppe landscapes, or when they were in these Gulag museums, or when they were witnessing a reenacted event of the, you know, eagle hunting, the level of satisfaction was really high because the way it was made and delivered was really authentic from the different perspectives that I just explained. It was very intimate. It was a high level of reciprocity between the local populations and the tourists. It was very small numbers as well, so they managed to spend time with them. They managed to ask questions. They were having guides on, you know, who were translating from Russian to English, for example, for them. And all of these small elements are not taken for granted. You know, if you don't study them, and if you don't experience, you know, if you don't study them, you can't really point them out to the tourist. You can't really manage, if you wish, authenticity on those places. So there were a lot of different strong implications for the tourism suppliers on the spot. And yes, the ones that had a very authentic tourism experiences, most of them came back to Kazakhstan. I know, because I managed to see most of them coming back to different tours, experiencing different types of experiences in the countryside in particular. But more importantly, they were recommending those places to friends and relatives. And then you start to see a VFR, you know, this visit friends and relatives segment coming and tapping into those segments that are crucial because these destinations are very hard to reach and they cost a lot of money. So people are not coming by chance there. They're coming because they are recommended to visit these places. And it's very hard to attract them. So now we've seen that in Central Asia. I've seen that also in Russia, but I've seen that in New Zealand as well. And I've seen that now in Scotland. So yes, it really acts as, if you wish, an element that can be used in the marketing strategy, in the promotional strategy. We didn't talk much today about country branding, but again, in country branding, authenticity has a very big role to play. I keep arguing with the Kazakhstani government that I'm linking with all the time because I'm involved with them for different things, that they should use their genuine or their former nomadic culture in their tagline, and they're working on it, but it's not yet adopted. But they're working on it clearly, developing actually a whole part of the heritage tourism industry around this, around the question of authenticity.
Thank you very much. We also have some questions from the chat. Aysula Garaiva, please, it's your turn. We would like to listen to your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, professor from University, which is located in Moscow, and I mostly studied in the entertainment industry and creative one. And tourism, as you said, is influenced so much during the pandemic. And my question is, did you analyze the target audience, which was mostly like used this type of the tourism, and what, if you recognize it, could you tell me the ages, maybe the countries which like more often to do it. And the second one is about the role of government, because I'm studying the creative industry mostly of the Asia Pacific region, and the government tries to arise interest from the other parts of the world to invite the tourists in a different part of the country, not only the capital. And they play a great role. Would we say that in the other part of the world, the government try to play or try to evaluate to improve the tourism?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, tourists came from all over the world. They came from the US, they came from Europe, they came from Russia, they came from Central Asia, including local Kazakhstani people who joined the tours. And the age brackets were absolutely, again, the age bracket was really wide. So we had teenagers, we had students, we had...
So there are no tendency. We can say that there are some tendency here. I mean, ages or something.
Again, from the data I had, it was really all kinds of tourists, including we had tourists who were almost 75 years old. And I remember one tourist that I interviewed, I said, "What are you doing here in the middle of nowhere?" And it was really interesting because he said, "Well, I visited the whole world, but why I'm coming to a nomadic tour in Kazakhstan in the middle of nowhere is because I'm going back to essential things. I'm going back to sharing a simple meal in the middle of the steppe with local populations. I'm having a real interesting time because we can exchange a lot with the local populations." So you see, you've got people who had all sorts of tourism experiences and are now choosing this kind of experience because they have experienced all of the others and they're interested to have something different. That's the first question. Your second question was back to the role of the government.
Yeah, the role of the government. I mean, do they like recognize the influence of their power to like recover this industry, or do you think does they think that this kind of the sector of the creative one can be like how to say wealthy?
You mean, I think the role of the government is crucial here because with COVID, they need to value rural areas more than ever before. And this is part of the national tourism strategy. If you look at Scotland, Scotland is trying to value now any of the regions, including Dumfries and Galloway, where we are, which is very rural. I've never been to Perm, but I can imagine maybe what's happening there. And it's really about looking at what are the cultural assets. Where are the different types of heritage products that can be valued in the strategy? Traditional dances, traditional food, traditional events around local traditions, all of these matter now. You know, again, lots of tourists now want to experience the latest online or the latest event that is very much embedded into a digital, you know, access throughout the phone or access throughout information and with the help of information and communication technologies. But I would argue that you can do that on the other side of the spectrum. You can actually emphasize real aspects of the tourism experience, not only the digital connectivity of that. So,
of course.
Yeah, the role of the government is to understand this and to embrace this and include this kind of tourism into the national tourism strategy, which is something that I'm trying to do now with Kazakhstan. Yeah, and I think it's for Russia. It will. Yeah. I am sure it is already happening, but you can emphasize this further.
No, I mean, so there are no institutionalization which is like protect this kind of sphere, only like some kind of Ministry of Culture or something, right? Mm-hmm. Only they are doing something, right? Okay, yeah. Okay. So I really liked your presentation, which was full of the information, and if it will be possible, I would like to connect with you because I'm the researchers in the same field there, which is dedicated to tourism too. So yeah, thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much. And the last question for today is Ivan Igorovich Mitin. Please, it's your turn.
Thank you. Thank you, Guillaume. I would like to ask generally 2 questions, but okay, you will just maybe skip one of them. So my first theoretical question is about where or whom does the authenticity belong to? Is it the authenticity of a place itself, or the local community which makes this place meaningful, or the tourism organizers who, well, just envision this local identity into a tourist product? And the second question, which is closely connected to this one, is about the connection of the notion of authenticity and the notion of uniqueness of a place. How do they interconnect? Thank you.
Okay, so your first question is what we call cultural landscapes. Behind the notion of cultural landscapes, you have the landscapes, so steppe landscapes, for example, but the local populations are heavily, of course, embedded into these landscapes. So to answer your first question, cultural landscape would be the answer. The authenticity is both the landscape and the population that live in those places. If you take the former nomadic culture, former nomadic populations were moving from one place to another, consuming the local resources with their yurts and their herds, and they were surviving on this mode of living. So you can't distinguish, you can't separate the landscapes from the populations, and that's what you need to sell. You need to sell back to a unique selling point, and this uniqueness, the uniqueness lies precisely in the mix of what I called in my thesis eco-cultural tourism. It's a mix of ecological and cultural tourism rooted in cultural landscapes of Kazakhstan. And in Russia, I mean, it is a fantastic place for doing research about this, because precisely your traditions are so rich, and you know, you've got so many different regions in Russia, and you could, for every single region, identify a strategy really to use those local resources and tradition and as assets, as products and experiences to produce this uniqueness, if you wish, for tourists. And you know what I would like to end today is that very often this is the question of authenticity is overlooked by the national you know, players and government officials, whereas it is a very important aspect of the tourism experience. So it is important to have a bottom-up approach, because the local communities know better than anyone what they can do, and it has to be embraced by the top levels. So we're talking really about a bottom-up approach to tourism development in cooperation with the government.
Thank you very